Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Fantastic. So, welcome, croeso, to tonight's event on Hidden Heroines, which is part of the Wales and the World Outreach Programme, led by the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing and the Cultural Institute at Swansea University. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speakers, Carolyn Hitt and Carolyn Lewis. First of all, we'll be hearing from Carolyn Hitt on hidden heroines and capturing stories that need to be told. Carolyn is an award-winning journalist, author, broadcaster, and BAFTA-nominated producer. She read English at Oxford University, began her career on the Western Mail, where she won Welsh Feature Writer of the Year, and then switched to broadcasting, joining the independent television and radio company Presentable Limited. In 2012, Carolyn co-founded the all-woman production company Parasol Media, and she's presented programmes for BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Wales, ITV Wales, Radio 4 and Radio Wales. Carolyn's interests include women's history, including the multimedia project Hidden Heroines, fronted by Cerys Matthews, which she'll be telling us more about this evening. And of course, rugby, on which she's written 2 books and presented and produced numerous sports programmes, including the acclaimed The Rugby Codebreakers. Carolyn was the first woman to win the Welsh Sports Hall of Fame Journalist of the Year and the first female to win Welsh Sports Journalist of the Year, going on to win the award for the whole of the UK twice. She's also a freelance writer and has written for The Guardian and Daily Telegraph and has been a weekly columnist for the Western Mail for more than 25 years. And in 2020, she won Columnist of the Year at the Society of Editors UK Regional Press Awards for the 3rd year running. Her proudest achievement, get ready for this, her proudest achievement, however, remains beating a 15-year-old Gary Barlow, no less, in the BBC Carol writing competition, A Song for Christmas in 1986. Is that really true, Carolyn?
Take that, Gary Barlow.
Gary Barlow is right. Is that really true?
It is really true, yeah. It was me and a bunch of teenage girls from Cardinal Newman Comprehensive in Rhydfelyn. And afterwards, Gary said, I don't mind not winning because good things will come out of this for everybody. And we went back to school with a voucher for W.H. Smith, and I think he did quite well afterwards, didn't he? So,
brilliant, absolutely brilliant. A very, very warm welcome. We're delighted to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Elaine.
Thanks. So following on from Carolyn's talk this evening, we are going to be joined by award-winning author Carolyn Lewis, who will be leading tonight's creative writing workshop. Carolyn is a prize-winning short story writer, published novelist, and creative writing tutor. She's published 2 textbooks based on her teaching methods, one of which has been recommended by Cambridge University Press as a definitive guide to writing short stories. Her work has appeared in Dyslexia, The New Welsh Review, Hono, Accent Press, and Root Publishing, amongst others. And for a long time, she wrote for leading women's magazines, and her work has been broadcast on local and national radio. And just yesterday, it was announced that her short story, The Leaving, is on the shortlist for the prestigious Fish Publishing 2021 prize, chosen from over 1,600 entries. Many congratulations, Carolyn. That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And Carolyn is currently working on a new novel for her PhD at Swansea University. So, as I'm sure you can tell, you're in for an absolute treat this evening. We are absolutely delighted to have Carolyn Hitt and Carolyn Lewis with us on Hidden Heroines for this wonderful talk and creative writing workshop. If you'd like to ask any questions during tonight's event, you're very welcome to do so. We would love to hear from you. You can do so by posting your questions into the chat box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Or if you prefer to ask your question directly to Carolyn, to either of our Carolyns, you can do so by using the little raised hand function, and our team behind the scenes will then unmute you so you can ask your question to the team. We'll also be posting links to our feedback survey forms, and we'd be so grateful if you could complete those for us. They will go into the chat box in the course of this evening's event as well. Okay, I think that's more than enough from me now. I am going to hand over to Carolyn. Thanks very much, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for such a generous introduction, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. It's a real privilege for me to be doing this with the Swansea University link. It's a special place for our family. My dad was the first person in generations of his family to go to university. He was a minor son, He went to Swansea University in the early 1950s. He's 88 now. I've spent most of lockdown looking after him. I'm not sure who's getting on each other's nerves most, but he was chuffed that I was doing this today. Although I was trying to explain I'm doing it through the computer, and I'm hoping I won't have too many technical hitches, because I've got a few clips and bits of audio and video to show you. So if you bear with me if any of those get a bit stuck. So what am I going to talk about? It's Women's History Month, and I'm looking at it from a Welsh perspective. The story of the first statue of a named Welsh woman in particular, but Welsh women's history in general, because it's a real passion of mine. My namesake, Carolyn, and I'm so glad there's another Carolyn, because we're always Carolines usually. So it's lovely to know somebody who can get Carolyn right. Carolyn will be picking up for a fantastic workshop afterwards. And although the stories I concentrate on in my work, some of the stories I'm going to share with you tonight are obviously real life factual stories. I really hope they'll provide you with some inspiration, because I think Welsh women's history is such an amazing field. There's material for everything from poetry to screenplays. I think it's also about whose story gets told, the importance of choosing those kind of narratives, uncovering hidden heroines, hidden characters, because, you know, as we know, the word history itself is his story. I'm hoping as well from a technical point of view that there are lots of crossover writing skills in the techniques we use in writing for print, for online, for radio and for television, in the way that we have to kind of hook our audience in and keep them watching, listening or reading. But just to kind of kick off, just to give you some context about my own involvement in trying to ensure we tell Welsh her story as well as Welsh his story, I'm going to kick off with a little bit about my background in journalism, which will explain how a kind of passion for making content about women's stories and targeting a female audience has been so important. So I'm going to do my first share screen. Here we go. And so a bit about me. Now, I started on the Guardian and I moved to the Express, but that's the Neath Guardian and the Merthyr Express. But what a great grounding to learn about communities, characters and stories. You're really on the doorstep of everybody you want to learn about and write about. Then I moved to the Western Mail. This is an ancient picture, as you can see by the age of the computers, the old MS-DOS ones there. And again, that was a really good training ground in all kinds of journalism. I was features editor by the time I left there in 1998, but they let me stay writing for them. And I've been writing a weekly column for, getting on for about 30 years almost now. The first picture in the left-hand corner is the Merthyr Express, where they thought it was funny to have a column called Hit Woman, complete with bullet holes. They moved on with their graphics department since then. And then I switched to television and radio. Here we are, I think, doing the 1999 World Cup, probably.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we can't see your screen.
Oh, sorry. Hang on. All right, hang on a minute. I'm saying it. I did think I shared it. Hang on a minute. Thanks for. Let me have a look again. Right. Let's have a look. Is that working now?
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic.
That's perfect.
There we go. You have a mismatch. There we there we go. In terms of visuals. Anyway, yeah. So there's the an early production, 1999. It was a World Cup series with a very youthful Ewan Griffith and a pink rugby ball there. And I also got to do a bit of presenting for a youth programme for HTV Wales, and they thought it would be a good idea to make us look nice and young and funky, the team. So they bleached my hair and some of it fell out. So they did a rescue job and they turned it this colour. So yeah, that was the end of youth presenting. So I switched really much more to producing, which I love, because it's almost it's more fun to be behind the camera in lots of ways, because you get to kind of shape things so much more. And I've been really lucky working with lots of great Welsh talent: Sean Phillips, Cerys Matthews, Gabby Logan, and this gentleman, Max Boyce. I've been Max's producer for about 25 years, and that could take up a whole other session, but we won't go there. And as Elaine mentioned, rugby has been a big theme in my career. I was asked to write about it when the World Cup came to Cardiff in 1999. And it struck me as a bit of a responsibility, because they'd not let a woman write about rugby in the Western Mail for the last kind of 130 years, but I knew that there was a huge female audience for it. And again, you know, as all of you are thinking about writing, it's so important to know and think about who you write for. And I knew that this was an audience that just wasn't being catered for. And in fact, it stretched back to the 1880s when places like Cardiff Arms Park were putting in extra seating for the comfort of the ladies. And my favourite story of all about the kind of expertise that Welsh women have always had on the national game was when the All Blacks visited Britain in 1905, took on a very famous tour where the only team they lost to was Wales. We beat them by the absolute thumping score of 3-0. But they also came to Newport, and the Daily Mail sent down a reporter that day. And very much as the Daily Mail does now, it always likes to get the kind of salacious, sensationalist, gossipy stuff, and was writing very much kind of colour pieces. And the reporter was just gobsmacked by what he called the way that the Newport women, whether they be the grandmothers, the matrons, the daughters, how much they knew about the science of rugby, much more than, as much as the men, they said, and much more than the Richmond ladies, for who it is the social thing. So yeah, we're an important audience in sport, and I've always tried to remember that in the kind of contents I've worked on. So yeah, and also kind of writing things that maybe the men don't look at sometimes. Lots of my male colleagues get very excited about statistics, whereas I think more about the kind of character, the game beyond the game, the way that rugby is a kind of prism for looking at Wales and Welsh culture, and in, you know, the spectrum of the way our natural identity, you know, the way we swoop from highs to lows, the kind of committees, politics, all of it is a great way of looking at Wales itself. And as I say, so I've done a couple of rugby books and made, gosh, probably over 100 programmes. But my other big passion, which is, you know, what we're talking about tonight really, is women's history. And in 2012, myself and two colleagues formed an all-female company, Parasol. That's my colleague Chris next to me, who's our production manager, and Sean is a multi-camera director. They're very busy at the moment making Only Connect. I don't know whether you've ever seen it. It's the hardest quiz on television. We make it. We can't answer any of the questions ourselves, but we work with a particularly impressive female role model, because, you know, quizzes are nearly always taken over by quiz masters rather than quiz mistresses. And we work with Victoria Corin Mitchell, who, again, in terms of great wordsmiths, she's really up there, but whether verbally or in print. And that's one of the interesting things we've found in broadcasting is how women are portrayed on screen, what kind of roles they're given. And it has changed a lot during, you know, my kind of time in it in the last 20-25 years or so. But one thing I've noticed, particularly as I'm growing older myself, is the challenges and the kind of barriers to portraying older women on screen. And those of you who know a little bit about Swansea University's history might recognise this goddess, in my view, Mavis Nicholson, who was at Swansea University the year before my dad, actually. And it was celebrated her 90th birthday last year. I'd always been a big fan of Mavis's. I'd grown up with, when I had a kind of sick day off school, sitting next to my nan on the sofa, watching Mavis in the afternoon, interviewing all the greats like Lauren Bacall and Betty Davis. And just the skill she had as an interviewer, I think it was unparalleled. But, you know, even within her own time, you know, she was kind of shunted to daytime and was never paid as much as the Parkinsons and Terry Wogans of this world. But I think she was an absolute genius in terms of the probing interview. And I went to BBC Wales a few years ago and said, look, I think it's time you did something on Mavis Nicholson. And I kind of reeled off all the great interviews she'd done. They came back in a couple of weeks and they said, well, we're really interested in putting Mavis back on screen, but you know, maybe she could present a programme on what it's like to be old in Wales. I said, Mavis interviewed David Bowie. Mavis knows these incredible stories. Mavis's own story really deserves to be told. And I remember going back to Mavis, who was then in her mid-80s. She said, oh, well, I'd do it under duress. She said, but go back in there and bat for me, kid. I love the fact she called me kid because I was very much middle-aged then, but I did, and I thought it was an important story to be told. So I'm going to show you a little clip from it now. If you just bear with me, I'm going to bring it up. Because one of the loveliest things about it was we got to meet all sorts of other people who were very excited about Mavis, and got to speak to people like Maureen Lipman, and if you just bear with me, I've got to find the other screen here. Where is it? Hang on a minute. I'm going to do this. And all these kind of people who had knowledge of Mavis's talents, and Elvis Costello was one of them, and people said, oh, you'll never get Elvis Costello, you know, he doesn't do interviews or whatever, but he did because he thought so much of Mavis. And another person who thought a lot about Mavis was Eamonn Holmes. And I'm sorry about this, but I can't, I'm going to do this out of the way. It was set up ready for you and it's somehow disappeared. So I'm going to do a quick Google and get it back for you. Okay, resume share. Can you see my screen now? Yeah. Here we go.
Shemai, the friend.
What do you think of her then? What do you think of her?
I'm just amazed you're still alive.
Eamonn Holmes is making good on a promise he made more than 30 years ago to visit Mavis at home.
Brilliant to see you.
And you?
It's brilliant.
Can't see the link.
Can I say thank you all for being here today? And I want to say thank you, Ireland, for making me feel very at home.
Yeah.
They worked
I
together
can't see the link.
in 1986.
A
fledgling presenter and Mavis a seasoned professional.
Can't do well. Can't do well as well.
You to me, you're this goddess of television. You're absolutely so brilliant, so amazing. But television had changed.
Sorry, can you see it?
No.
No. Oh, someone
No.
is kind of stopping my share remotely. So when I can do it again. Hang on. Can you see it now?
The friend.
Is that working? No, right. Hang on a minute. Sorry about this. I'll do a new share. Right, is that working?
Then what do you think of her?
I'm just amazed you're still alive.
Eamonn Holmes is making good on a promise he made more than 30 years ago to visit Mavis at home.
It's brilliant to see you.
And you?
It's brilliant to see you.
And you?
Yeah.
Can I say thank you all for being here today? And I want to say thank you, Ireland, for making me feel very at home here.
They worked together on Open Air in 1986. Eamonn, a fledgling presenter, and Mavis, a seasoned professional.
Come to Wales. Come to Wales as well.
You to me, you're this goddess of television. You're absolutely so brilliant, so amazing. But television had changed. You had got that in-depth interview where it mattered, where questions were important, where people cared about the quality of what you were talking about. That's all different now. But they would give you things like, say, Mavis, you have 6 minutes for this interview, which is an eternity. And you'd say, 6 minutes? 6 minutes to do this? So anyway, 26 minutes later, you were still talking.
That's not true.
All right, 16 minutes later. 16 minutes later. But nowadays, if you disobey that, nowadays the PR companies rule the interview shows. They decide who you interview, what you're going to ask them. It's totally different. Who is there on television, genuinely, that you would switch on and you would say, I am going to learn something or get a master class? It is just, it's frivolous. Everything's frivolous. Everything's about a joke and a gag, and we don't talk to anybody seriously for any length of time. When you look back, and people should look back to see what an interview is about, watching you and what you do, and you would pick difficult interviews. You wouldn't get those interviews nowadays. I mean, David Bowie, to interview David Bowie,
Yeah,
Sophia Loren, Elizabeth Taylor.
There we go. Did that work? Apologies. What was great about, you saw Eamonn Holmes there, and I rang him up and we'd arranged for us to go to London to just get his stories on Mavis. And then halfway through the conversation, he said, I want to come to her, he said. I'm fed up of talking to about people and they've already died. I want to go and see her, he said. And I said, well, that's great. But I just warn you, Mavis lives in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And he said, I don't care. Just tell me where to go and I'll be there. And he kind of gave up the whole weekend to come and see her, and it was great. But it was just really important to get someone like her recognised, because again, her story was kind of seeping out of popular memory. You know, you have to be a certain age to remember her on television. And we managed to get, I'm going to just go back to my share. There we go. The following year, we, hang on a minute, managed to get the BAFTA Cymru Lifetime Achievement Award, which we kind of, you know, jokingly, Mavis and I call the Still Alive Award. And, you know, she was finally recognised in Wales for what she did, which was so important, I think, because it's not that surprising. You know, some of you might be familiar with Professor Deirdre Beddoes, kind of the godmother of Welsh women's history. And she wrote an essay, gosh, it must be 30 years ago now, called Images of Welsh Women. She said, Welsh women are culturally invisible. And I think our desperate ignorance of the incredible women who've shaped Wales was illustrated in 2004, when a poll funded by the Welsh Government asked the public to vote for their 100 Welsh heroes. Now, at the time, it was the biggest response they'd ever had. 80,000 votes were cast. But how many women do you think made it into the top 100? 9. And who do you think the only woman to make it from 2,000 years of Welsh history into the top 20? Yes, it was Catherine Zeta-Jones, which, you know, fair enough, an Oscar-winning actress, but very much somebody who was kind of in the popular culture of people's minds, rather than, you know, drawn from the knowledge of the past in the same way as people were voting for Nye Bevan and Owen Glyndwr and those kind of figures. And then in 2008, the National Assembly, as it was then, launched another vote. This time they called it Top 10 Welsh Idols. And again, the Welsh public were asked to cast their votes. This time, only one woman made the cut. And it was Catherine Jenkins. And again, you know, a successful modern figure, but why couldn't they think of one other significant Welsh woman in that 10 from history? And Hywel Dda was on that list, you know, and people were obviously thinking about celebrities as well, but it's not as if he's ever been on telly, is it? And voters were knowledgeable enough to vote for somebody whose celebrity rests on developing the Welsh legal system in the 10th century, but they could only come up with one female, famous female from the past 2,000 years. And I got quite angry about that at the time. So this was the result. We made a 4-part series in 2006 called Land of Our Mothers, presented by one of our most impressive modern icons, somebody who I've worked with a lot, Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson. So I'm just going to play you a clip from there, and I'm hoping to do it a little more smoothly than my last clip. Here we go.
At the start of the 20th century, my great-grandmother was helping Wales become one of the most important industrial nations in the world. It was a time when women were fighting for the vote, but here in Wales there was a figure as formidable as any suffragette, the Welsh man. She slaved on the home front so her husband could slog at the coalface. And the truth is, the land of our fathers wouldn't have prospered in the way it did if Wales hadn't also been the land of our mothers.
We can't see it, Carolyn.
Oh, sorry, hang on. I don't understand, because it's telling me that my screen is sharing and yet you can't see it. I don't know, hang on a minute. But you can hear it and not see it, presumably, yeah?
Yeah.
Right, okay, give me 2 seconds. Let's have a look. I'll do a new share. And I'm going to press on this. All right, can you see it now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to just scroll it up a bit because otherwise your ears will be blasted by the tone. Here we go.
At the start of the 20th century, my great-grandmother was helping Wales become one of the most important industrial nations in the world. It was a time when women were fighting for the vote, but here in Wales there was a figure as formidable as any suffragette, the Welsh man. She slaved on the home front so her husband could slog at the coalface. And the truth is, the land of our fathers wouldn't have prospered in the way it did if Wales hadn't also been the land of our mothers. Was a miner's wife, but you won't find her name in the history books. They concentrate on the men who toiled in the pits, quarries and docks, the men who built up the towns as the population exploded. But women contributed massively to this brave new Wales. This new Wales at the start of the 20th century was built above all on one commodity, coal. In Wales has always been seen through men's eyes. It was dangerous work and it was men's work. A woman's place, on the other hand, was in the home, but that makes it sound like the easy option. It wasn't. In fact, domestic work in my great-grandmother's generation was relentless. It never, ever stopped. Daughters, wives and mothers effectively became domestic labourers, their lives dictated by the work of their husbands, sons and lodgers. And then there were the kids. Welsh women at the turn of the century spent an average of 15 years having children. It was unpaid and hardly ever recognised as work at all. But the industrial growth of Wales couldn't have happened on anything like the same scale without it.
Women were the slaves of the coal owners. Their own working lives revolved around the miners' shift system. They were preparing hot meals and hot baths several times a day, with husbands, sons, lodgers coming in, maybe at 7 a.m, 3 in the afternoon, 11 at night.
Until you've tried, as I have once tried, to wash in a tub with a dolly and then to dry the clothes and then to iron them with a flat iron. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And I remember a friend of mine telling me about her mother, who was so exhausted at the end of the working day that she would put her hands on the brass rail above the fireplace, and she would fall asleep with her head on her hands, standing up like a horse, because she was just so physically exhausted. And that's just one woman out of the thousands and thousands who slaved and toiled, as their husbands did underground, just to keep the coal out of the clothes and the home.
But it wasn't just the physical slog. The woman had to take full responsibility for the running of the household, hence the emergence of one of the most potent stereotypes of our history, the Welsh man.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Good place to stop, the Welsh man. And as you saw in the clip, the emphasis was so much on ordinary women, the women whose stories weren't recorded and who didn't ever make the headlines. And you know, one of the most remarkable stories we uncovered in the series was that because of the burden of domestic life when you had a house full of miners and lodgers in many cases, the statistics showed that in the 1900s, women in Pontypridd and Rhondda were more likely to die young than miners. And you think of the kind of all the dangers of working underground and how much that impacted on people's health and safety. But the fact that women were lugging hot tin baths and they were having prolapses, children were getting scalded. And as you know, Deirdre Beather said, we have the figures for the amount of coal and the tonnage of coal and steel and all these kind of statistics about men's industry, but where are the statistics on women's lives? So I felt it was really important to get, as well as the kind of key women, people who have made names, who have made history, it was kind of giving voice to so many ordinary women and their life stories. And another strand I thought was important was to kind of capture, again, I've mentioned it already, the stories that were about to disappear, to get those generations on film, on record, giving their stories. And that, when Upstairs Downstairs was back on television and Downton Abbey was very popular, I thought about the generation of women who've gone into service, because basically, between the wars, the only job opportunity you had as a young girl in the Welsh valleys or in other parts of Wales was to go into domestic service. It was literally the only option you had, however bright you were, whatever your skills were, you were forced into that, particularly after the First World War, where so many women had taken over men's jobs, and there's this sense of women being put back into their place. So they were either back in the home or cleaning somebody else's home. And one of the kind of biggest privileges of my life really was talking to ladies who were then in their 90s, because this was kind of 2011, 2012. And I'd said to Radio Wales, I said, look, if I don't make this program now, those stories will be gone. Can I do this program? So it was called The Real Upstairs Downstairs. And I took two women, and they both had polar opposite experiences of being in domestic service. One had gone to the house of the Mountbattens, and it really was a bit like Downton Abbey, where the servants were made to feel almost part of the family, as much as that can ever happen. And she'd gone as a 14-year-old girl from Caerphilly, and she said it was like a magical adventure, living in this mansion. And yes, it was hard work, but we were treated well. And it's something that stayed with me all my life. She was always giving talks to the WI with her scrapbook and things. But her experience was very much in the minority. And it's never left me the story of Amy Inglis, who was 95 when I interviewed her. Never left her village of Llanharan and was put on a train to London, met by a chauffeur, taken to Kent to meet the mistress of the house. And anyway, this is what happened next. It's just a short audio clip. So just bear with me. And do shout if you can't hear it, will you?
Taken to the nursery to be checked over, and it wasn't very successful. She first of all asked me my name, my full name, and I told her Eva Amy Hutchins. Oh, she said, we can't have that. She said, you'll be Eva in future. We have an Amy already, to start us. So the second question was, are you pregnant? Well, since I was only about 15, I was hardly that, coming from the house I'd come from. So the last girl they'd had was Welsh, and she was pregnant. She thought that the Welsh were rather easy people. She didn't think much of them at all. The third question, of course, was, she said, you must stop calling me Mrs. McGrath, she said. In future, I am to be addressed as Madam. So I said, I'm ever so sorry, Mrs. McGrath. My grandfather's always taught me I'm as good as, but never better than. And then she exploded. Oh, it was hell. No life for a little girl. And that's it, a dowdy, lousy life.
She really was remarkable, no longer with us, sadly, but if anybody would like to hear the full program, I'd be happy to send you a link, because it was such an eye-opener. And and these ladies are kind of our grandmother's generation. We're not too far away from the kind of lives that they lived. But at least Amy gave her boss what for at that point. She was very spirited. So this brings us on to the statue story, because again, we've kind of endeavoured in various broadcasting projects to kind of capture women's history. And then a few years ago, as you'll remember, the kind of whole subject of statues kind of exploded. And just bear with me. Oop, wrong one. And I wrote you are seeing this now, are you? Yeah? Yeah. I wrote an article after Carolyn Perez, who you'll all know is the lady who put the Jane Austen on the banknote. She did a kind of register of British statues. And if you think about it from our perspective, if you walk around just Cardiff, our capital city, you will see men on plinths everywhere. You know, the male heritage is kind of baked into our very streets. There's Nye Bevan, Ivan Novello, Lloyd George, Gareth Edwards, Tasker Watkins, Fred Keener, and then, as everyone says, the chap with the cone on his head in the haze, the friend of freedom, of course, John Batchelor. But there was not a single figurine of a female who actually lived, as opposed to generic statues of womanhood. You know, as we saw earlier on, the statue of the Welsh man, which is actually from Pier, where I'm from. There were plenty of kind of generic women around, but in terms of somebody who was named and who lived, apart from Boadicea in City Hall, there was nobody. And you know, it's a scenario that's replicated across Wales, across Britain, and has been across the world until recent years, when people have really started to make a fuss. And as I say, Carolyn Perez looked at the gender makeup of the statues listed in the UK database of Public Monuments and Sculpture Association, and she found some remarkable figures. 925 statues, only 158 women, and of those, they're mostly allegorical figures. We're talking naked nymphs and you know, the scales of justice, or the Virgin Mary, and so many of Queen Victoria. And she found at that point, this was 2016, that only 25 statues of historical non-royal women existed in the UK, which is just a scandal when you think about it. Anyway, so I wrote this article on the Welsh kind of angle on this, and looked at, you know, what we had, which was basically nothing. And the article was picked up by Helen Molyneux, who was at that point the chair of the Institute of Welsh Affairs, and we had a kind of tenuous connection. We'd gone to the same school, but we hadn't crossed over, and she'd gone out with my brother briefly. And I knew of Helen by reputation, and lovely woman, and very impressive, you know, a real kind of somebody who just gets things done with not much fuss. Anyway, she rang me up and said, I read the article, come and have a gin and tonic and we'll have a chat about it. She said, I'd like to do something about the fact that there are no statues of a named Welsh woman. So we went and had a gin and tonic, and she knew that at that point, Central Square, where the BBC and the central station are, was at that stage of development where everything was being planned for it. And whenever you have a development of that scale, there's always some money put aside for public art. And she wanted to make sure that that fund was put towards a statue of a woman. And this was, she put together a kind of group of women drawn, we all kind of knew each other vaguely or closely, women from the media, from the arts, from people who actually knew about how to make statues, people who worked in that kind of art, public art conduits between people who want a statue and putting people in touch with sculptors. And we initially called ourselves Put Women on a Pedestal. And then somebody pointed out that that acronym was PUP, which, you know, it's not very good in Welsh. So we changed it to Monumental Welsh Women, which also sounds like moo, but was slightly better than PUP. And for probably about a year, we just used to meet, have a drink and think, how can we get this done? And we started lobbying the council, public art consultants, endless meetings, and fair play to Cardiff City Council, because there are some very labyrinthine rules on statues, particularly in Cardiff, because they have to have some link to the city, but then you argue well, it's the capital, so you should be able to have anybody there. And in the end, they came back and said, look, our only criteria is it must be a piece of art that it's the place where everybody wants a selfie. And the site for it was identified. And of course, Central Square isn't quite looking like that now. But if you imagine walking out of Cardiff Station and looking past the BBC to where the old, by where the old Boots was on that corner, I think, in the old Western Mail building, it would be about there. So at that point, the group invited women sculptors, and we thought it was important that women artists put forward their bids to tender, and 3 were shortlisted, and they really were 3 renowned sculptors. It was amazing the bids they made: Lucy Orter, Eve Shepherd, and Laura Ford. And Eve Shepherd is in the middle there. She did Stephen Hawkins a few years ago as well, and it was very exciting to see the ideas they were coming up with, and how excited they were about being given this kind of privilege. And then we put together a panel of experts to choose a long list of 50 historical women, and from which came a short list of 5. And the Women's Equality Network, Wales Women's Equality Network, came in at that point as well, and did a lot of work and research on it too. And the 5 that were shortlisted eventually were, now Elizabeth Andrews. I mentioned earlier on about the Welsh mam and the burden of industrial life. Well, Elizabeth was somebody who was very active politically at a time when women didn't have the vote, really, when she started out. And she basically looked after the woman in the home, the rights of the woman and child in the home, maternity care. She fought for pithead baths, to take that drudgery away from the home, and stood up in the House of Lords. And the Times reporter wrote quite scathingly about, this kind of little woman from the valleys and what she was wearing and whatever, in the Sankey Commission into mining conditions. But she said, look, I've got an important point to make about how women are suffering, and pithead baths would take away that burden. She was a suffragist. She was one of the first female magistrates, and she was known in the community as Our Elizabeth. She also founded the first nursery school in Wales, which my mother went to in 1938, I think. It was founded in 1935, and I went to in the 70s as well. So it's a wonderful woman. Betty Campbell, gosh, again, you could fill a whole programme on Betty Campbell. Wales's first black head teacher, community warrior. She broke down so many barriers, from the minute that headmistress in school, when she said, I'd like to do your job, I'd like to grow up and be a teacher. And headmistress said, oh, my dear, the barriers would be insurmountable. But, the more barriers were put in Betty's way, the more she broke through them. Just a remarkable woman. The woman behind Black History Month in Wales. She's the reason so many people knew about Black heritage 30 years before, the more recent campaigns. An incredible woman. Cronogwyn, known as the most remarkable woman of the 19th century. She was a master navigator. She was the first woman to win a poetry prize at the National Eisteddfod, beating all the established bards. She founded a woman's magazine, which even had a problem page. She spoke across America. She set up a home for homeless girls. Incredible woman, absolute multitasker. Elaine Morgan, who I knew personally, great heroine of mine, somebody who again could do anything, Renaissance woman, excelled in both the arts and science. She's the reason we have a kind of feminist interpretation of evolutionary theory. Who knew that women had a part to play in the story of man? And of course, gave us some of the best TV drama that's ever been written. And Lady Rhondda, suffragette, businesswoman, the reason women are allowed to take a seat in the House of Lords, again, a pioneering journalist, and she went to prison after blowing up a postbox, and the plaque is still there, and went on hunger strike for the suffrage cause. Again, an all-round fabulous woman. So we thought we had a cracking shortlist, but at this point we needed to get the public to be invested in them, to learn about them, and for this to be more than just a statue. It had to be something that people were invested in. So at that point I stepped off the Monumental Welsh Women group because of a kind of conflict of interest, and Helen and I went to the BBC and said, look, will you take this on? We want to get the public to vote. We want you to kind of take ownership of it. And the only way we can get the message out there is if we can take over your airwaves, basically, in every single form. So I then oversaw all the content that was going to go out on television, on radio, social media, online. BBC Education got involved to get packages for schools. And we had a public vote, and then the winner would be broadcast live on Wales Today. We had a tight budget, and we wanted to brand the campaign in a kind of way that appealed to young people as well as more mature people. And we had all sorts of challenges because imagery is very expensive. Also, some women had lots of images and lots of archive. Cynogwen had a couple of photographs. You wanted to make them all equal in the way they were presented. So instead of doing conventional location films, we used animation and green screen. We used a fantastic company called Rough Collie, and I remember saying to them, because I just didn't have enough money at that point to get them made in the way we wanted to. And I just said, just think about, I know you've got daughters and you'll be walking past that statue in a few years' time and you'll be able to say, Daddy, help with that. And he almost cried then, and I got a good deal. So they branded them. We wanted it to look a bit like Banksy meets Welsh women's history. So we had this kind of brick wall idea, and we took one image of each. And as you can see, we did this. And we got Cerys Matthews to front the whole campaign, very passionate about Welsh women's history. So she was a great fit for it. So I'm just going to show you, play you a short clip of one of the films, just to give you an idea of how we got the message across. So if I do a new share, and I do this.
Sarah Jane Rhys has been described as the most outstanding Welsh woman of the 19th century. Known by her bardic name of Cranogwen, she was a pioneer in many fields, from poetry to journalism. But her first claim to fame was as a master mariner. From the time she was a little girl in Llangrannog, Cranogwen was determined to live a life of adventure. Her parents wanted her to be a dressmaker, but she persuaded her sea captain father to take her on board ship. For 2 years, she worked as a sailor on cargo ships between Wales and France, before returning to London and Liverpool to further her nautical education. She gained her Master Mariner's certificate, a qualification that allowed her to command the ship in any part of the world. Back in West Wales, she became a head teacher at 21 and also taught navigation and seamanship to local young men. In 1865, her writing skills turned her into an instant Welsh celebrity, as she became the first woman to win a poetry prize at the National Eisteddfod, beating the major male Welsh poets of the day. She went on to be one of the most popular poets in Wales, exploring themes from Welsh patriotism to shipwrecks. And in 1879, she became the first woman to edit a Welsh language women's magazine, Y Frythones. It campaigned for girls' education and even had a problem page. Cranogwen was brilliant with the spoken as well as the written word. At a time when public speaking by women was frowned upon, she embarked on a career as a lecturer, temperance campaigner, and preacher, travelling across America not once, but twice. And while she didn't live to see her dream of a house for homeless girls built, the shelter Llety Cranogwen was opened in her memory after her death in 1916. Cranogwen, then, so many groundbreaking achievements for a woman born 180 years ago.
So I chose Cranogwen there because she was literally the person we had no archive for at all. So it was important to kind of get her story across in a you know, a kind of visual way, where we literally had one photograph of her to work from. And the result of the kind of multimedia campaign, because for a week we just kind of saturated all the platforms available to us, was great. There was a lot of public engagement, quite a bit of controversy. We had men on Twitter saying, well, I don't know who any of these women are. And we thought, well, yeah, that's exactly the point. We had women who knew a lot about Welsh women's history saying, oh, well, it's a bit of a beauty parade. Why have you chosen these? And, you know, ideally, I'd have liked a much bigger shortlist and to have taken over the BBC for a month. But, you know, we kind of had to work within the parameters we were given. Lots of media coverage, lots of schools got involved. They were sending in their pictures of the statues that they would like to create, and they held their own votes. Bianca Jagger retweeted us at one point, which was quite exciting. And I'll say this very quietly because we got more votes and we're not supposed to reveal this fact, but we did get more votes than sports personality in Wales that year for our campaign, which was very, very exciting. And then it all built up to the big reveal where on Wales Today, the winner was projected. And I'm really glad the winner was who it was. I'll just get it up for you now. And it was, of course, Betty Campbell, by a mile. And what was wonderful was, particularly in her own community of Butte Town, you know, a lot of older people who remembered Betty but weren't particularly media savvy, they were literally being kind of propelled towards the community centre and to show how to use the computers there to set up to help vote. So it was just a wonderful night. And particularly at that time, it was, you know, we were kind of at the height of the kind of Brexit aftermath, and there was just so much kind of negativity. And I felt like Wales had made a really positive statement by choosing somebody like Betty, who, you know, embodies so many aspects that we need to think about when we think about who we are as Welsh people. So it was very exciting. So I'm just going to show you, to finish off, the Betty's own clip. And
Betty Campbell was told a working-class black girl could never succeed, but she proved her doubters wrong. She became Wales's first black head teacher and championed her nation's multicultural heritage throughout her life. No wonder Nelson Mandela sought her out on his only visit to Wales. Born in Butte Town, Betty was raised in the poverty of Tiger Bay. Her mother struggled to make ends meet after her father was killed in the Second World War, but Betty won a scholarship to a Cardiff school, where her classmates were mostly white middle-class girls. Always near the top of the class, Betty told her head teacher she too would like to teach, but the response was, "Oh, my dear, the problems would be insurmountable." Those words made Betty cry, but they also made her even more determined to follow her dream. She overcame setbacks and racism to pursue her goal. In 1960, she was one of 6 female students at Cardiff Teacher Training College, which was admitting women for the first time. When a teaching job became available in Butte Town, Betty felt it was made for her, but she still faced hostility from some parents. Yet again, she defied her detractors by becoming the first black head teacher in Wales. She had made history, and now she wanted her pupils to know their history. Inspired by a trip to America, where she learned about the story of former slave and abolitionist Harriet Tubman, Betty put black culture on her Cardiff curriculum. Her pupils learnt about the positive contribution to British society by people of colour. She also helped create Black History Month. Betty's fame spread beyond Wales as her school became a template for multicultural education. And her influence on public life grew too when she became a member of the Commission for Racial Equality. She also proved a passionate advocate for the people of Butte Town as a councillor. No one fought harder to celebrate Wales's diversity than Betty Campbell.
now the statue of Betty Campbell, Eve Shepherd was the sculptor chosen, and the statue was, if we hadn't had a pandemic, would have been unveiled last summer. As you can imagine, along with everything else, it was the creation of it was put on hold for a long time, but it's currently in the foundry. I can't tell you exactly what it looks like because you'd have to kill me, but it's about 3 meters high. It's much more than a statue. It's taken so many elements of Betty's life, her community, her achievements. It is many stories in one artwork. It's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's going to be one of those. It's going to be a massive talking point when people see it in Cardiff. We're working on a documentary at the moment, Betty Campbell, the story behind the statue, and it weaves together the 2 narratives of Betty's own life and how the statue was created. We've been waiting for the restrictions to ease a little bit so we can kind of go and see her family properly and and get the last part of the documentary made. And what's lovely as well about the project as a whole, the Hidden Heroines, there is a sense of legacy. The Welsh Government came forward with £100,000 to ensure that the other women on the shortlist will also be memorialised. So the Elaine Morgan statue is already in progress and commissioned. Because what's happened as well is that people in the respective communities of the women on the shortlist have kind of got involved and because statues are very expensive, so they've been fundraising. Lady Rhondda has a group backing her. Cronogwyn as well, particularly when the National Eisteddfod will resume. They're very much behind that, the people of Ceredigion. The only person who's kind of been left out is Elizabeth Andrews, which I'm upset about personally because she's from my patch. And I'd love somebody to champion her, even if it's something as small as a mural, because I appreciate the statues are kind of expensive things. But there is a sense of legacy. And as I say, you know, we feel that we hope that other towns and cities now just take up the baton and remember the women who are important to them in their communities. And there's a website called monumentalwelshwomen.org, and it's got a tagline, 5 women, 5 statues, 5 years. You can go on there and have a look more about their stories, and on the BBC website, which I've kind of cherry picked tonight to see bits and pieces about. And you think, you know, why statues? Because in many ways they are kind of patriarchal monuments, aren't they? You know, you've seen the kind of anger and hurt that they've evoked through the past year. And yet we felt it was important that you can't be what you can't see. That's the phrase, isn't it? And I think particularly young girls in Wales, they take their inspiration from the visual culture they're saturated in with social media and Instagram and all the pressures of that kind of imagery. And they don't see themselves represented in the same way as men do on our kind of towns and cities. And we wanted to normalize female achievement. And when we wanted young girls to go and take a selfie next to Betty, basically, and become part of a new story, another chapter. So I've rambled a bit. I've had some technical breakdowns, but I hope I've given you a flavour of, you know, what's important to us as content makers, and the kind of richness of material that's there to be kind of plundered in our history. You know, the land of our mothers, grandmothers, daughters. You know, I still think we've got an awfully long way to go, but I hope I've given you some food for thought, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I know I've gone over time as well, probably, haven't I? I know you've got a workshop to get on with. Here we go. Oh, look, yes, here we are. Yeah, that's a really good question from Mae'r here. What else can we use to remember these women? Certainly isn't the money to make statues for all the Welsh women we remember. I quite like and they do this quite a bit in America when they have kind of virtual halls of fame and online resources. And in the same way as we look at museums now, and they, you know, we can't even visit them, can we? But they put so much of their kind of items and paintings and whatever online so we can enjoy them. I'd love to see and it wouldn't take that much money. I'd love to see a kind of awesome Women of Wales Hall of Fame where you could just go to one stop on the internet and learn and draw up all the kind of research materials and be inspired by them, because it is difficult to, you know, statues are hugely expensive. But equally, things like projection, I think about Ireland as well, have a day where they project notable women from their history on their main buildings in Dublin, and that's really striking. But yeah, it has to be done in a way that's accessible. And I think if the lockdown has taught us something as well, I think it's opened up a virtual world of wonders. So I'm hoping that we can think a bit more laterally and imaginatively about how we celebrate our history in that way as well. I'll just check if there's anything. Karen says, Elizabeth Andrews lived in my village. Get them going, Karen, get them going. I really would love somebody to take on Elizabeth Andrews as a subject, and even if it's just a purple plaque.
I did some studying when I did my degree, and Elizabeth Andrews was one of the women that I chose because she lives locally in our village, or she lived, I should say. And when she came up, I was just, oh, thank God somebody else has remembered Elizabeth Andrews. So I've just messaged our village councillor as well. And we've got a zip world that's been built up here. And they were looking for information and photographs because they wanted to build like a memorial to the miners. So I've messaged them as well and said, maybe you should do a memorial to Elizabeth Andrews, who's just done the pithead baths on the site you are now building on.
Yeah. Oh,
so, yeah,
incredible. Mae'r's also mentioned Sarah Hughes. Yeah, did a lot to look for statues of women in Wales and Cardiff, especially. Also didn't get enough credit in this conversation, I think. Fair point. I did get in touch with Sarah during the campaign to share some of our thoughts with her. I know Sarah's done a lot of research into this. We both did a Radio 4 documentary last year with Jasmine Donahue on just the kind of representation women visually. I know Sarah's done some great work with the East End Women's Museum as well, isn't she? With I know she's an expert in women's heritage. So yeah, that's a fair point. Let's have a look. Oh, Mary, that's a lovely thing to say. Thank you, appreciate that. and condolences as well. That's that means a lot. Thank you. But there's an even better Carolyn waiting in the wings now. So I don't want to encroach on the time you have left. As I say, I wish it could have been slicker. I've not done this before with lots of kind of screen sharing and bits and pieces. But as I say, do have a look at the websites if you've got time. The Hidden Heroines BBC website, all the films are on there, lots of background information, and the Monumental Welsh Women's Own one as well, because they've got, if you ever want to get involved with supporting the campaigns or just learn a little bit more about this field, there's plenty of information there. And yeah, thank you for your patience, as well as your responses.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was absolutely fantastic. We are all applauding you. It was wonderful. Real joy to have you with us. Thank you. And without further ado, we're going to hand over to Carolyn Lewis, who is now going to lead you into a fascinating creative writing workshop based on, well, thematized around all the wonderful things you've just heard Carolyn talking about. Carolyn, over to you.